Hey students, welcome to week 7. This is our second week we are working on poetry. Good job for hanging in there with the first week of poetry. I feel like poetry is always one of those units that students sort of approach initially, at least, feeling like it's a mystery, or that it could be anything, that there are an endless amount of interpretations to have with each poem. And as you probably are aware, that is not necessarily the case. There might be multiple interpretations, but certainly it's not limitless. A poem can't be about anything as far as a reader is concerned. So also good job for hanging in there with the older poetry too. I try to just touch on some really famous or canonized pieces in our book, but certainly we don't have time to go through them all. Initially, years ago when I started teaching this class, I used to just give, I don't know, I would assign somewhere between 10 and 20 poems a week. And, as much as I love them and I wish everyone would know all of these poems, the reality is that we can't really talk about them in depth the way we need to, unless I'm assigning fewer poems. So every week or so you'll have about maybe 5 to 10 total to read and to understand. So even though they're short, we're certainly going to be reading them multiple times for that level of meaning. Just an update on your essays. I am grading those. I'm moving through a couple of them a day. I apologize if it already seems like a lifetime since you turned that in last week. I am a human who has other classes that I teach online and also face-to-face, and I have children and I commute just like a lot of you do. So, a lot of times I'm up till 1 o'clock in the morning trying to grade through them and do the best that I can. But you will have them back before we do the next essay, so I do promise you that. So if you are overly concerned or anxious about that, please make sure you send me an email and let me know so I can quell your fears a little bit. But I do try to turn them around as fast as I can. This week specifically, we'll be talking about persona and tone, which are two things that I mentioned last week, but this week we're going to dive into them a little bit more. So let's see here if I can click on this first thing, persona. As you know, the persona is a speaker. A lot of times this is the voice that a poet will take. So remember that poets are not always the persona or the speaker. They might have things in common or situations in common with the speaker, but when we as literary students, students of literature, are to refer to them, they are speakers and personas. They are not the poets themselves that are speaking in these poems. Sometimes a persona can be a person. Sometimes it's an unidentified person. Sometimes we don't have a gender or an age. Sometimes it's almost like a narrator of a story where you're not really sure who they are. You might be more sure of maybe their vantage point if they're just sort of observing what's going on. There are lots of poems out there that actually don't even have humans as speakers. For instance, I can think of a poem Patricia Smith did years ago about Hurricane Katrina, and one of the voices of in that collection, Blood Dazzler, I think it was called, but one of the poems, the speaker was the hurricane. In another poem, a speaker was the dog who was stuck in the Hurricane Katrina. So speakers, again, don't always have to be human. So just keep that in mind. They can be anything, really, truly. So every poem does have a persona, and besides reading for the literal meaning of a poem, you should also be figuring out who's speaking. That's one of the first things you actually want to do as you approach these poems, is just to ask yourself some simple questions about who's speaking. Tone is the other thing we'll be diving into a lot this week, and tone is just simply the attitude or the mood that a speaker has about the poem's subject. Tone can be multi-layered, so I do want to point that out to you right now. A tone in the beginning of a poem might shift a little, or subjects might sort of shift or sway. So there might be multiple tones in a poem, and tone is one of those things that if you don't have sort of a cache of words ready to go, it can feel very elusive to you as someone who's trying to figure that out. Your book actually does a really good job of telling you that you should just have sort of a list of adjectives to have on hand to help you kind of narrow down tone. So I just wrote a few of them up here just to stick with a little, visual, but certainly there are a lot more tones out there. So page 400 has a little list of them, but there are plenty more. So any kind of adjective that you can think of. I'm looking at the stormy cloud little list over here. I can think of, a lament essentially could be a mournful kind of a poem, right? There's lots of ways that you can describe a poem. So again, if you have a little list available to you when you're trying to figure out what the tone is, it does make it a little bit easier. So if I were you and I was taking notes, I would turn to page 400 and kind of write that list down yourself and maybe add some things or words that you would prefer to help describe different kinds of poems. Certainly depressing, I don't think I see that on this list. A speaker of a poem can be depressed over a subject matter, right? Or brokenhearted. Those aren't things that are listed on that list. So feel free to just sort of add to that as you see fit. I do want to make sure that I break down a little bit more this week about close reading these poems. These poems are going to ask you to read them multiple times. And the first time you just might want to read it just to dive in. That's how I usually try to approach poetry, is I just read it one time and say okay, well, what am I going to get myself into? The next time that I read it, I'm actually reading for literal meaning. What is actually going on in the poem? The next time I read it, I might ask myself who the speaker is and maybe what the subject of the poem is. And all along the way, I personally am writing in the margins of these poems to try to underline that or pinpoint that or just, even trying to just connect certain ideas together. Next, I'm going to try to read to find the tone. So I usually try to figure out the speaker and the subject first before I figure out the tone. And part of the reason for that is once I can identify who's speaking and speaking about what, it's a little bit easier to figure out how they feel about that thing versus trying to find how they feel about that thing and then try to figure out who the speaker is. That's easier for me, but I certainly think you could do it the other way if you really wanted to. Once I kind of get my finger on a tone or I kind of narrow it down, sometimes I have to just narrow it down hey, this is sort of a positive poem or this is a negative poem or happy, sad, thumbs up, thumbs down. I then try to sort of read it and go back looking for words or phrases that I would think that would support my tone. And for me, if I find that I have multiple tones happening. This is usually when I'll break out the colored pens or the highlighters and just see what I can highlight that'll work for, let's say, a positive tone or a negative tone. And that way, as I start to collect my evidence, I can see, okay, well, maybe the positives sort of outweigh the negatives or vice versa. Then I also will try to read to find a central message of a poem. So what is the poem trying to say? And see if I feel like that works with who's talking, the tone, and then those words or phrases that support that tone. Later in the next week or two, when we start discussing rhyme and rhythm and form and metonymy and synecdoche and all those other devices, you're going to continue to read for those things too. So I'm just letting you know now that these poems, again, are asking you to read them multiple times. You should not really be able to read through the poem one time and have everything figured out. I've been reading poetry for a long time, and I promise you, I still have to go back through these things and read them, 3 and 4 times. Even poems I've read, 100 times, like My Mistress's Eyes or Nothing Like the Sun. I've read a lot, and I still have to go back and reread that a couple of times before I start talking about that poem, because I want to be sure that I am remembering the words the way I feel that I remember them, or the way that rhyme happens in the poem, or, the iambic pentameter, or whatever it is. So never be reading these poems just one time. That's not how it's really going to happen. So again, this is just sort of a public service announcement, if you will. Let's look at my Papa's Waltz, just in terms of determining tone. So again, the way that I would do this is figure out who's speaking first. And we read this one last week, and we were able to determine fairly quickly that it's a son, an older son, who's looking back on his childhood. And the subject that he's speaking about is the father, and specifically this waltz, which I've put in quotes here because it's kind of hard to determine whether that waltz is a good thing or it's a bad thing. And so part of what we're going to do right now is to talk about this tone, right? Is how does this speaker feel about his father? And here's how I kind of break this poem down. I see two things happening. I see sort of this negative tone and this positive tone happening. So what I thought I would do is just make a short little list for each one that I felt like could fit in either category. So for instance, I'm going to start with negative stuff. Whiskey on your breath to me felt very negative, especially from a young child's perspective. Dizzy, that word for me connotes nauseousness. Dizzy isn't a fun thing, especially as an adult. Hung on like death, I mentioned that last week, but to hang on to something like death is terrifying and scary. And so for me, that just is a check mark in the negative tone box. The next line of the poem says that such waltzing was not easy. When things are not easy, that typically can be a negative thing. Maybe not always necessarily, but especially for young children, things sometimes that don't come easy can often feel frustrating or not worth it or rigorous in some way. The pan sliding off the shelf definitely seemed like a negative thing to happen, especially because that dancing motion seems quite violent. And so if the dancing is so wild that the pans are sliding from this shelf, to me that sort of signals a form of violence there. There's the line then that my mother's countenance, or excuse me, two lines, my mother's countenance could not unfrown itself, which means that the mother could not bring herself to smile at this moment. So she is not happy here, watching the father and the son have this exchange. There's also that battered hand, battered hand on one knuckle, and that's the hand that's holding the young boy, right? So certainly battered. When I hear that word, I think of, an abused domestic situation, right? So again, putting that in that negative connotation category. The ear scraped by a buckle, again, that's not a positive thing. This dancing is so wild and crazy that this poor child, right, his ear actually scrapes against his father's belt buckle, which again feels like some kind of form of violence, whether that's intentional or unintentional, right? The next line says, you beat time on my head. That word beat is very telling. It's, yes, you can beat time in terms of just tapping, but also that idea of beating someone, of hurting them or bringing them physical punishment or pain. The palm that's caked hard by dirt. So you have this hand that's layered with dirt, which to me signals some kind of maybe working class father, but also the way that is described doesn't seem like it's a positive thing. It's caked, meaning that there's just layers and layers of dirt that just won't come out. And then that last image of the young boy still clinging to your shirt. So again, I'm putting that in the negative connotation or the negative tone category because the idea of just clinging on, there's that old expression or cliche to cling on for dear life or to hang on for dear life, that for me sort of connects to that. On the flip side of this, right, if I saw this, my Papa's Waltz, as a positive thing, there are several things that could fit in with that as well. Whiskey on your breath certainly can be a more positive thing, especially if you're an adult, right? And again, this is an adult who is looking back on his childhood. Dizzy for children can be very playful. Certainly my kids, when they were much younger, would love to go to like a park, and if there was a grassy hill, would just do sort of log rolls down the hill. And even though they would try to stand up and they'd be so dizzy they'd fall down, they would just laugh with joy. So certainly to some children, being dizzy is an act of play. The idea of waltzing, not only is that a beautiful dance and beautiful music, the poet has chosen here to use words like waltz and waltzing. And that word romped to me says something that's much more fun than it is negative. That line, the hand held, so it's a hand holding to me is sort of an intimate act between, people who care about each other. It doesn't seem aggressive or violent in that, at least that word choice to me. Again, beat time just in terms of a musicality. Hard by dirt. So again, what you're seeing here, right? I've listed that in the negative, but also here in the positive. I think you can think about that in terms of, working class or somebody being proud of how hard that their father might have to work in order to provide for them. The penultimate line here, then waltz me off to bed, right? That is a lovely sounding line, first of all, because of that connotation of to be waltzed off to bed. This child, at least in that line, isn't being thrown right down a hallway or into a bedroom, right? He's being waltzed, and he's clinging still to the your shirt. Maybe he still wants his father, wants his papa. So as you can see here, there are both things happening in this poem, and you could use either or to support your idea here. So it just depends on how you approach this poem. Your book actually suggests that we all bring our own personal background, our history, our experiences, our love, our loss, right? Our family, all of that kind of stuff to everything that we read and consume. And so it's very hard to separate sometimes how we feel about certain subject matter with what we're actually reading in the poem. And that's okay, right? The book even says, like, hey, if you had sort of maybe a negative experience with your own father, you might actually feel that My Papa's Waltz is more of a negative thing. Versus if you had maybe a more positive experience with your father, you might feel that My Papa's Waltz is a more positive tone to it. The book does advise, and I do strongly suggest that you just sort of temper that a little bit. Make sure that you are not allowing your personal experiences to determine what a poem is trying to say and or the tone of a poem. You can certainly allow those things to inform you, but don't let them sort of take charge and run amok. Even if you are feeling sort of deeply moved by that, right? You still want to ground things in evidence of the poem. So lines, words, phrases, rhyme, rhythm, all of that kind of stuff. And one thing that I would say is it can be both things too, right? And that's kind of the beauty for me of this poem. I think having that dual, that complex emotion of how one feels for a father is, to me, available in this poem. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both things. I think as children, and I mentioned this last week, but I think as children sometimes we can feel that our fathers are these great and wonderful people when we're children, and then when we get older, sometimes we learn that maybe things weren't always as they seemed. Does that make the former experience untrue? No, of course not, right? It actually makes both things true at the same time. So again, just be kind of open to those interpretations as they happen. What I do like about this particular chapter too is that on page 406 gives you some really good ideas about how to develop your analyses of these poems. And so it sort of says to take things like persona and tone, right, and have them contribute to your overall interpretation. And so at the bottom of 406, it gives you 3 different possible theses that you could work with. And actually, you could write a full essay about either one of these. So the first one here says, the tone of Rothke's My Papa's Waltz reveals the speaker's ambivalent feeling towards his father. So again, that whole essay would be about how the speaker feels ambivalent. And you would find words and phrases and tone and meaning that would support that. The second one says that the tone of Rothke's My Papa's Waltz subtly conveys the speaker's resentment towards his father. So again, everything in that particular essay would prove that the speaker is angry towards his father, but that it's subtly conveyed, right? It's not an outward anger. It's not a sort of lashing out. It's hidden behind maybe the guise of the waltz. And then the last thesis here says the speaker's affection for his father is effectively captured in the tone of Rothke's My Papa's Waltz. So in this last one, if you were writing an essay like that, right, the speaker is affectionate towards the father. And again, you would write a whole essay in service to that. So as you are crafting these discussion boards this week, I want you to think about coming up with a thesis that sort of looks like one of these things, right? You are going to be analyzing these poems. You're going to be talking specifically about tone and persona. And what you really should do too is craft a thesis that goes along with that, right? Every poem has a tone, every poem has a persona. So what is that poem trying to say through that speaker? And about that particular subject. So see if you can actually kind of develop those theses a little bit there. I do want to strongly suggest this week that with the I think it's 5 poems that you're reading, that you know exactly who is speaking in each poem. So make sure you kind of identify, you kind of put your finger on, okay, well, is this just an observer? Is this someone who's participating? Is this someone who's in the family, right? Figure out who is speaking. And then how does each speaker feel about the subject matter that they are talking about? So make sure that you identify those 2 particular things. Make sure you also take your quizzes by Wednesday at 11:55 at night. Your discussion board will be due by Thursday, 11:55 at night, and then your discussion board responses will be due by Saturday. So this week should feel fairly typical for you. The discussion boards this week, it's a lot like last week where you got to pick 2 of the poems to speak about, but simply I'm asking you to come up with an interpretation of the poem based on what you figure out about each persona and each tone. So if you have any questions, certainly email me, and I will see you on the discussion boards. Bye.